The other day, this video from The Closer Look came across my recommend, Show Don't Tell is Terrible Advice. I generally like The Closer Look's videos, but as an avid fan of Show Don't Tell myself, I went into the video a little skeptical. But then, about 4 minutes into the video, I asked myself, wait, is he just going to be talking about exposition? And short answer, yeah, the video was solely about exposition. Which is fine, to be clear. It was still a good video, and I would say I agreed with most all of it, given how he defined his terms. But anyway, The Closer Look realized he ended up tunnel visioning, as he put it in his pinned comment, and noted that Show Don't Tell doesn't refer to exposition exclusively. There are a lot of things that Show Don't Tell encompasses, and while this video certainly will not touch on all of them, I want to touch on some of the major ones. And in doing so, I'm going to tell you right now, there are times when you should for sure tell rather than show. As with all guidelines in writing, SDT is not gospel. To undertake this endeavor, I will largely be referring to two books, Truth is the Arrow, Mercy is the Bow by Steve Almond, and On Becoming a Novelist by John Gardner. I also wanted to include quotes from several short sentences about writing by Verlyn Klinkenborg and The Half-Known World by Robert Boswell, but this video would have been a little too long, so this is me telling you now that you should read all 4 of these books if you're interested in the craft of writing. Oh, also, Alone with All That Could Happen by David Yaus is pretty good. And one more note, in this video I'm going to home in on fiction and poetry, but a lot of the principles discussed here will still apply to creative nonfiction. So I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but what actually is the purpose of fiction? Or rather, what is it we hope to achieve when we write fiction? Well, John Gardner puts it pretty well in my opinion. We read 5 words on the first page of a really good novel and we begin to forget that we are reading printed words on a page. We begin to see images. We slip into a dream, forgetting the room we're sitting in, forgetting it's lunchtime or time to go to work. We recreate with minor and for the most part unimportant changes the vivid and continuous dream the writer worked out. That phrase, the vivid and continuous dream, is one that Gardner used more than once across his writings. The goal truly is to let your reader slip into a world that feels real, even though it's not. And you might say, that's not the point of my fiction. My fiction is meant to convey meaning. And that's great, more power to you. But if you can't captivate your audience, that meaning's as good as useless. What's important here is that you can't just focus on imagery and description. You also have to take advantage of your medium. To quote Steve Almond, I've worked with students who are dedicated readers, and yet I continue to encounter manuscripts with far too much vivid camera work and far too little actual storytelling. Vital information has been withheld, and the result, I often feel, is that I am not being told a story at all so much as being asked to solve a puzzle. For a while, I was sure this had to do with how creative writing is taught, and specifically the sustained dogma against exposition that finds its purest expression in that well-meaning mantra, show, don't tell. So this actually gets at what The Closer Look was talking about. When you attempt too much showing in your exposition, your reader, ironically, can feel disoriented. Almond goes on to say that the way creative writing is taught isn't the only issue. The prevalence of visual media is also not ideal. Students try too hard to mimic visual media and, in effect, forget that their story has a narrator, when most visual media doesn't. Man Carrying Thing mentioned this very briefly in his video about writers who don't read. Gardner talks about this too, how a lot of student writers don't write their own most important stories, but instead write through the filter of what they've seen on TV. Ergo, there are moments when you should show, and there are moments when you should tell. But how do you know which moment is which? Who knows? Okay, I don't mean to be blasé, but the point is you can do whatever you want in writing as long as it works. I know that sounds nebulous, but it's true. Almond discusses this multiple times, in particular with characters and narrators. I think most of us embark on our stories with an intuitive sense that we will discover our characters by putting them through their paces. What's more, most of us do this work in a mode known as indirect characterization, meaning the reader learns about the character through her actions and thoughts at a particular moment in her life. Direct characterization comes directly from the narrator, who can bluntly report essential facts that would take much longer to convey in scene. Almond uses Jane Austen as an example, particularly in Emma. For years, I confused interiority with intimacy. I assumed that plunking a reader behind a character's eyeballs would grant them access to that character's soul. Austen's narrators prove to be extraordinarily intimate guides precisely because of this capacity for efficient delivery of context, combined with piercing psychological insight. So again, the question is, how do you know which narrator to use? Well, this might seem supremely unhelpful, but you kind of just have to feel it out. It's going to be different for every story. But Steve Almond's ultimate point is that you can't leave a reader feeling confused. No matter what type of narrator you choose, no matter what you decide for your characters, everything has to be clear, even when you're showing. As for Gardner, the case is much more clear-cut as to what showing versus telling actually means. The writer with a truly accurate eye can tell his story in concrete terms, not just feeble abstractions. Instead of writing, "she felt terrible," he can show, by the precise gesture or look, or by capturing the character's exact turn of phrase, subtle nuances of the character's feelings. The more abstract a piece of writing is, the less vivid the dream it sets off in the reader's mind. One can feel sad or happy or bored or cross in 1,000 ways. The abstract adjective says almost nothing. The precise gesture nails down the one feeling right for the moment. This is what is meant when writing teachers say that one should show, not tell, and this, it should be added, is all that the writing teacher means. Good writers may tell about almost anything in fiction except the character's feelings. Even when it comes to backstory and exposition, Gardner says it's absolutely fine to tell those things, and I really want to focus on Gardner's example phrase there, "she felt terrible." Indeed, that's a pretty boring and ungraspable phrase. If we were to rewrite it, we might do so, as Gardner advises, with a gesture, look, or turn of phrase. Let's assume terrible refers to the state of her health rather than, say, an emotional state. We could write the phrase as, "she leaned forward, sealed her eyes shut, and wrapped her arms around her stomach." Or, "she looked back and forth between the trash can and the bathroom." Or, "she said, 'I'm going to hurl my stomach up out of my body.'" What's more, Gardner points out that this is where figurative language becomes so important. We could rewrite the phrase as, "she felt like her body would crumble any minute," or "she felt as though her stomach would cave in on itself." Again, keep in mind, context is important. Like I said, we don't know what state terrible refers to here. Say what you will about the quality of each of these examples, but I would argue that they're all more concrete than "she felt terrible." To quote Gardner again, "with rare exceptions, the character's feelings must be demonstrated. Fear, love, excitement, doubt, embarrassment, despair become real only when they take the form of events, action or gesture, dialogue, or physical reaction to setting. Detail is the lifeblood of fiction." There's another video on this platform called "Show Don't Tell is a Lie" from Hello Future Me. The title is more provocative than the actual video, not that I would know what that's like, but there are a couple points I want to bring up that corroborate Gardner's point here. Hello Future Me follows Stephen King's advice when it comes to adverbs, telling us to avoid the words very and extremely in particular. In King's mind, these words take specificity away from the writing. Or if we were to put it in Gardner's terms, very and extremely make the writing more abstract and therefore less vivid. As Hello Future Me points out, there's not a very specific, concrete, stark difference between being afraid and being very afraid. Saying horrified is much stronger than saying very afraid. But we can go even deeper than that. Oftentimes, adverbs feel too abstract or too redundant. Take this phrase, for example. "Papa," she said excitedly. How much lifting is the word excitedly actually doing in that sentence, especially when we already have the exclamation point? It's both redundant and abstract. We could rewrite it as, "Papa," she shouted. Again, context would matter there to show what kind of a shout we're supposed to read there. To show things even more effectively, we could write, "Papa," she jumped up and down in front of him. That said, there are effective ways to use adverbs. As Gardner says, adverbs are either the dullest tools or the sharpest in the novelist's toolbox. Or to quote the poem Arte Poetica by Vicente Huidobro, "when the adjective gives not life, it kills." However, returning to our phrase, while the jumping up and down does demonstrate excitement, it's also a bit of a cliché, no? And this is something Hello Future Me and John Gardner talk about. Even though a cliché might technically be showing, when you've heard something so many times, it feels like telling. My favorite example Gardner uses would be cocking an eyebrow in that quizzical way he had, but you can note the other handful of phrases he uses here. Okay, so, to summarize this portion of the video, showing is most vital when it comes to character emotions. When it comes to context, telling might actually be preferable in most cases. That too is a point Hello Future Me makes. Telling might often be the most efficient thing to do and the best thing for your story's pacing. However, I want to talk about show don't tell in a few other contexts too. Characterization, linguistics, and content as it correlates with meaning. When it comes to characterization, Almond says, "In my own struggles with characterization, the snag is nearly always insufficient data. My construction of character, at least in initial drafts, is often just a description. I provide a facial feature to a profession, maybe a verbal tic. I think, okay, that should be enough. It's not enough. Because every person around us, from the bored bureaucrat putting us on hold to the tool who just flipped us off in traffic, possesses a rich and tortured inner life. Now, keep in mind, not every character has to be fully developed. As Almond says, characterization does not have to be a democratized process. You can have minor characters who do not need to be fully fleshed out. However, I do want to read you this portion of a letter that my advisor in my MFA program wrote to me recently. I remember George Saunders used to talk about characterization in terms of brushstrokes. He meant that small little corrections could be enough to make a character really blossom into specific life. One little detail describing the shape of a character's forehead might be enough, for instance, to make a reader see their entire face in clear, vivid detail. One little detail about their habits, beliefs, or attitudes might be enough to make their personalities blossom into full, vivid life. I think Margaret Atwood and David Mitchell are two examples of authors who are great at this. If you read Hagseed or Cloud Atlas, you see how even a lot of the minor characters have these small details that make them feel alive, like real people with a rich and tortured inner life, as Almond says. Or, for an example in a visual medium, there's Fleabag. And please skip ahead if you don't want minor spoilers for this show. I really recommend you watch it if you haven't already. The character played by Jamie Demetriou, sometimes referred to as Teeth Guy or Bus Rodent, is defined primarily by, if you couldn't already guess, his teeth. This character is largely played for laughs, and his physical appearance plays a big part in that. But his last moments in the series are extremely revealing. After having sex with Fleabag, he says, "You don't go through life with teeth like these and not know when someone's pretending." And this is, funnily enough, a moment where telling is extremely effective. Telling is sort of a dramatic necessity in this instance. This detail about this character that was initially a joke becomes something much deeper when paired with some interiority. In this case, the interiority is spoken aloud, but you get the idea. I know I said I wouldn't quote from the half-known world for the sake of time, but I do think this Robert Boswell quote pairs nicely with Almond's. Fiction writers who attempt to deal with a stereotype by merely disrupting the character's adherence to type are like the playwright who puts a pond on stage. They are confusing their medium. The better method is to suggest the parts of the character that are, by most standards, invisible. In other words, assume that the attributes that make the character a type are merely the surface features. Another way to put it, write the character so that his actions and dialogue suggest that the reader can only ever half know him. If you're trying to make sure a character isn't a stereotype, it's not enough to just disrupt the stereotype. What Boswell means when he says that is inverting a stereotype isn't enough to solve it. For example, you don't make a sweet old lady less of a stereotype by giving her a sailor's mouth and a motorcycle to sit on. No, in that sense, you've just created another stereotype. The way to truly avoid a stereotype is to just write a complex character. Easier said than done, certainly, but remember Saunders' brushstrokes. Even small details can paint a character who is real, vivid, and alive. Good characterization also falls in line with good context, ergo, good telling. Almond writes, "My students often struggle to understand what precisely the reader needs to know and when. They worry that I am asking them to spend their precious early paragraphs on dental records. I'm not. Unless you're writing a book that hinges on dental records. I just want to know enough to feel what I'm being shown, because characters do not live in a world composed of vagaries. They take shape, or should take shape, within a precise set of dramatic circumstances, of which your loyal reader should be apprised." I really want to emphasize that bit in the middle. I just want to know enough to feel what I'm being shown. The word feel is very important when it comes to show, don't tell. And granted, feeling is very subjective, but remember what I said in my video on objectivity. Consider the commonly negotiated consensus on what makes quote-unquote good art. Good characters are products of showing and telling. As one of my undergrad writing professors said, character is as character does. That is, you reveal a character through their actions. But contextually, we have to know enough about a character, be told enough about a character, to understand why they would make the decisions they do. And sorry, I'm going to recommend one more craft book here, Mr. Potato Head vs. Freud by Clint McCown. I honestly wanted to include his entire chapter on character here. Obviously, I can't do that, but he opens the chapter by saying characters are not Mr. Potato Head. You can't just pin characteristics on them, especially not just surface-level physical characteristics. You need to go deeper. You need to define your characters on a subtextual level too. Moving on, let's briefly talk about showing in the linguistic sense. Ideally, your language should correlate with whatever it is you're writing. Gardner puts it as such when describing the author who employs interesting language. His sentence rhythms fit what he is saying, rushing along when the story rushes, turning somewhat ponderous to deal with a ponderous character, echoing the thunder of which the story tells, or capturing aurally the wobble of the drunk, the slow, dull pace of the tired old man, the touching silliness of the 40-year-old woman who flirts. You may have heard it said that Shakespeare writes upper-class characters in verse and lower-class characters in prose. That's actually not strictly true. Shakespeare does whatever he wants. For example, in Pericles, Marina and Lysimachus are both upper-class characters, but they swap between prose and verse as they please. However, their dialogue to each other still communicates something about them. To quote my undergrad Shakespeare professor's written lecture on Pericles Acts 4 and 5, in the case of Lysimachus and Marina, if poetic verse has a relationship to social class, it pertains to classed behavior, not class status. Marina's verse has an elevating effect. On herself, Lysimachus looks up to her when she uses it, and on Lysimachus, she raises his intentions above his base desires. To the extent that Shakespeare's classist society associates elevation with aristocracy, Marina's verse makes herself appear highborn and makes Lysimachus act like the ruler that he is. This advice to paint with your language is especially prevalent in poetry, where the expressiveness of the language is so important. For example, take this poem by Joshua Siegel. I don't like poetry. I don't like similes. Every time I try to think of one, my brain feels like a vast, empty desert. My eyes feel like raisins floating in an ocean. My fingers feel like sweaty sausages. I don't like metaphors. Whenever I attempt them, a hammer starts beating in my chest. Lava starts bubbling in my veins. Zombies have a fight in my stomach. I don't like alliteration. We learnt about it in school, but it's seriously, stupendously silly, definitely drastically difficult, terribly troublingly tricky. I don't like automatopoeia. I wish I could blow it up with a zap and a bang and a crash, a boom and a clang and a pow, a clash and a bam and a thud. And I don't like repetition. I don't like repetition. I don't like repetition. So, granted, it's pretty obvious what Siegel is doing here, but even so, there are some interesting features. Similes like a vast empty desert and metaphors like a hammer starts beating in my chest and lava starts bubbling in my veins are all a bit cliché, but then they're contrasted with figurative language that's more original. My eyes feel like raisins floating in an ocean, my fingers feel like sweaty sausages, and zombies have a fight in my stomach. I also like how the ellipses at the end of the poem suggest the repetition just goes on forever, but like I said, this is a really obvious example of what Gardner is talking about. Siegel is being very clear with his irony. A more subtle example would be in Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. Consider the phrases wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command, and boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Notice that all of these phrases employ a bit of alliteration. But that, I would argue, is not their most interesting feature. I would say what's most interesting about these phrases is how aurally they all kind of describe what it is they're talking about. The alliteration certainly helps in that regard, but even the word wrinkled kind of sounds like what it describes, doesn't it? Like I said, this technique is especially important in poetry, where sound is all the more emphasized than in prose. But lastly, I want to talk about showing in terms of content and how the content correlates with the meaning of the work. In terms of plot, Almond puts it very simply. Plot shouldn't just spur external action, it should expose the internal conflicts that plague your characters. Ergo, plot is another device at your disposal to reveal interiority. In fact, most all great stories and poems use physicality to uncover something internal lying beneath. What Almond is getting at here reminds me of what T.S. Eliot called an objective correlative. To quote from the Poetry Foundation, T.S. Eliot used this phrase to describe a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events, which shall be the formula of that particular emotion that the poet feels and hopes to evoke in the reader. There must be a positive connection between the emotion the poet is trying to express and the object, image, or situation in the poem that helps to convey that emotion to the reader. Eliot thus determined that Shakespeare's play Hamlet was an artistic failure because Hamlet's intense emotions overwhelmed the author's attempts to express them through an objective correlative. In other words, Eliot felt that Shakespeare was unable to provoke the audience to feel as Prince Hamlet did through images, actions, and characters, and instead only inadequately described his emotional state through the play's dialogue. Eliot's theory of the objective correlative is closely related to the Imagist movement. So for example, your story might be about an office worker in a dead-end job, and the objective correlative might be a fly trapped in a spider web in the corner of the cubicle. The fly positively correlates to the state of the office worker through a feeling of being trapped and doomed. As an aside, I first learned about objective correlatives in a workshop from Clint McCown, and Clint actually disagreed with Eliot's conclusion on Hamlet, saying the play very obviously had an objective correlative, the skull that Hamlet holds in his hand. It really doesn't get more obvious than a living man talking to a dead man and asking to be or not to be. But anyway, back to Almond's point. Objective correlatives don't have to just be physical objects as symbols. They can also be situations and chains of events, i.e. plot. In Almond's case, his example is a psychoanalyst/therapist who's addicted to poker. His wife finds out and gets him to quit playing, but things become complicated when his newest patient is the poker world champion. The plot in this scenario very clearly reveals the main character's internal conflict, and all the more when the psychoanalyst discovers what his patient's tell is. A good poetic example would be The Fish by Elizabeth Bishop. I caught a tremendous fish and held him beside the boat, half out of water, with my hook fast in a corner of his mouth. He didn't fight. He hadn't fought at all. He hung a grunting weight, battered and venerable and homely. Here and there his brown skin hung in strips like ancient wallpaper, and its pattern of darker brown was like wallpaper, shapes like full-blown roses stained and lost through age. He was speckled with barnacles, fine rosettes of lime, and infested with tiny white sea lice, and underneath 2 or 3 rags of green weed hung down. Whilst his gills were breathing in the terrible oxygen, the frightening gills, fresh and crisp with blood that can cut so badly, I thought of the coarse white flesh packed in like feathers, the big bones and the little bones, the dramatic reds and blacks of his shiny entrails, and the pink swim bladder like a big peony. I looked into his eyes, which were far larger than mine, but shallower and yellowed, the irises backed and packed with tarnished tinfoil seen through the lenses of old scratched isinglass. They shifted a little, but not to return my stare. It was more like the tipping of an object toward the light. I admired his sullen face, the mechanism of his jaw, and then I saw that from his lower lip, if you could call it a lip, grim, wet, and weapon-like, hung 5 old pieces of fish line, or 4, and a wire letter with the swivel still attached, with all their 5 big hooks grown firmly in his mouth. A green line frayed at the end where he broke it, 2 heavier lines, and a fine black thread still crimped from the strain and snap when it broke and he got away. Like metals with their ribbons, frayed and wavering, a 5-haired beard of wisdom trailing from his aching jaw. I stared, and victory filled up the little rented boat, from the pool of bilge where oil had spread a rainbow around the rusted engine, to the bailer rusted orange, the sun-cracked thwarts, the oarlocks on their strings, the gunwales, until everything was rainbow, 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 and I let the fish go. Here, the fish itself, with the 5 hooks in its mouth, is clearly the objective correlative. But to what is it correlating? Well, the first thing that comes to mind would be the victory that fills up the boat. What kind of victory? The victory of life, its resiliency. The fact that we, as living beings, survive against all odds, just as this fish has survived 5 previous attempts at capture. As such, the speaker can't help but let the fish go, considering everything it's clearly lived through. And in that sense, the fish also seems to be an objective correlative to the speaker themselves, insomuch as the speaker is a stand-in for all of humanity. Part of me wishes we knew a little more about the speaker, but I think the lack of description there is intentional. The speaker isn't necessarily supposed to be just one specific person, but a stand-in for something larger, just like the fish. Of course, feel free to disagree with this reading. There are a couple more layers of show don't tell that I want to discuss. But first, I want to bring up what I think are good examples of telling that employ showing, along with a bad example or two. All of these good examples come from books I've read recently. The first example is from Karen Russell's short story collection, Vampires in the Lemon Grove. In this story, the main character, Nal, is disappointed when his older brother starts dating the girl he likes. To cope, he takes to his journal and starts writing questions he would ask the girl. 1. What is it you like about my brother? List 3 things, not physical. 2. What made you want to sleep with my brother? What was your thought in the actual moment when you decided? Was it a conscious choice, like, yes, I will do this, or was it more like collapsing onto a sofa? 3. Under what circumstances can you imagine sleeping with me? Global apocalypse, national pandemic, strep throat shuts down the high school. What if we were to do it immediately after I'd received a lethal bite from a rattlesnake, so you could feel confident that I would die soon and tell no one? Can you just quantify for me, in terms of beer, what it would take? This passage stands out in the story for a few reasons. Yes, Nal is being very explicit with his feelings here, but he's telling in a creative and engaging way. I especially love the simile in asking if it was like collapsing onto a sofa. The passage might be a little on the nose, but it works because 1, it's humorous, 2, it's in line with Nal's character to express himself like this, and 3, he's writing in a journal, a place where you're supposed to lay yourself bare. The next example comes from Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness. This book takes place on a planet whose inhabitants are androgynous, but every 26 days or so they become male or female, not permanently, just for a short time. Every 26 days, it could be one or the other. As such, on top of being a sci-fi story, the book is largely an examination of gender in our world. At one point, one of the aliens asks our main character, a human, if women of the human species differ much from the men. The main character responds, no. Yes. No, of course not really, but the difference is very important. I suppose the most important thing, the heaviest single factor in one's life, is whether one's born male or female. In most societies, it determines one's expectations, activities, outlook, ethics, manners, almost everything. Vocabulary, semiotic usages, clothing, even food. Women tend to eat less. It's extremely hard to separate the innate differences from the learned ones. Even where women participate equally with men in the society, they still, after all, do all the childbearing, and so most of the child rearing. Le Guin packs a lot of meaning into this dialogue, most importantly that while there may be innate differences between men and women, the differences that matter most are systemic. I believe what Le Guin is getting at is to say that men and women really aren't so different at all, but the constructs we invented in human society lead us to believe they are. We have come to believe the lies that we ourselves invented. It's in the main character's later dialogue down the page that those invented divisions really show themselves. I can't tell you what women are like. I never thought about it much in the abstract, and God, by now I've practically forgotten. I've been here 2 years. You don't know. In a sense, women are more alien to me than you are. With you, I share one sex anyhow. He looked away and laughed, rueful and uneasy. Le Guin has created such a fascinating frame around which to analyze gender, that being an explanation of gender to aliens who do not experience it, aliens who only have sexual anatomy every 2 to 5 days of the month. So even though she is doing a lot of telling through her character in this instance, it still feels like showing. What the main character is saying feels authentic to him. We also see a lot of what Gardner was talking about with gestures and turns of phrase, especially in that last bit. He looked away and laughed, rueful and uneasy. In fact, despite how clear these passages feel with their meaning, I would go as far as to argue that they're more showing than telling. Our last example comes from 50 Beasts to Break Your Heart by Jenna Rose Nethercott. In a lot of Nethercott's stories, the narrator will deliver the meaning of the work rather plainly. Consider the story called Drowning Lessons, wherein the narrator says this. When a person drowns, it's because the body calls for something it can't have. That is to say, your body demands that you breathe, even when no oxygen is available. Holding your breath is a conscious choice. The longer you hold it, the higher the carbon dioxide levels in your blood rise, and the desire to breathe intensifies. The desire mounts and mounts until eventually the desire is so irresistible that you willingly allow water down your airway and into your lungs. You choose this. Every cell in your body insists, this is what you need. There is a wanting, and there is yearning. And then there is a lung filling with water. Now, I won't lie, some of these moments in Nethercott's stories actually sort of take me out of the story, and yet these moments feel necessary, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Here, Nethercott is getting at her theme, the heart of her story. She's telling us pretty plainly this is a story about the difference between wanting and yearning. But again, like Le Guin, even though this meaning comes through pretty clearly, Nethercott isn't just simply telling us, she's using her figurative language to compare drowning to yearning, how the body's and brain's reactions are the same in both cases. It's extremely creative, and it slots so well into an amazingly told story with a wildly creative premise. Poetically, I find that this poem demonstrates telling pretty well. To Thousand Island by Sneha Madhavan Rees. The only time I tasted you was in a fast food restaurant on an elementary school field trip. I heard myself saying your name only because the girl in front of me had asked for you. Her name was Amy. Amy was confident and popular, and she knew about things like salad dressing. I had never eaten a salad in my life. Our house always smelled of Indian curries. I didn't know the name of different dressings, even that there were different dressings, or even that there were such things as dressings. I was maybe 8, it was maybe grade 3, and we were all on a field trip and had brought money for lunch. I don't remember where we were going, but I remember Amy's voice. I listened carefully, so I'd know just what to order. When you arrived, orange and tangy, I didn't like you at all. But I was happy. Perhaps I could find my way in this world after all. Now, personally, I do kind of wish this poem had more poetic features, but like I said, I think it's a poem that demonstrates telling pretty well. It's a poem that earns its telling. If you think about it, the first 15 lines are all showing that preps us for the telling in the final line. The anecdote is a display that demonstrates the meaning which Madhavan Rees lays out plainly. As a contrast, here's the first poem in Danae Young's chapbook, These Pink Cocoons of Ice. Pink Noise. When you were nothing, your parents cut off the tongue of a horse and showed it to your relatives as a gender reveal. They ate dissected guavas from the supermarket. Your 5th birthday, you took off your shirt like a boy at the pool and ran down the block. Mothers screaming behind you. Magenta in the mere footprints of the wind, the same color as your clothes, an alternative. Now you investigate the branches. Hear paper leaves shivering, testing their fruits. Some fall like frozen iguanas, candescent like the sequins on a mini dress. Pink fingers frost a tree's tangled intestines in preparation for the reaping. Pretend by fidgeting your own. Wonder if that's why you found an ice cube in your chest after refusing to climb down the sycamore. The neighborhood boys could see straight up your skirt. Even while wearing skin, lace was the only thing blushing. Lifespans dot the ground as they hit. How long? What age? Doze off to ambiance and question the relative danger of living amidst the invisible. Reconsider the shiv of your mother's voice. Femininity dripping in stallion's blood. A transaction flayed to the colored bone. So I'll keep it 100 with you guys. This poem took multiple readings for me to really get it, and even now I think there are certain things that I'm still missing. That said, even if you didn't catch everything that this poem was getting at, there were probably certain images and instances that stood out to you and revealed something. For me, it would be your 5th birthday. You took off your shirt like a boy at the pool and ran down the block, mothers screaming behind you. Like Le Guin's work, this poem too, at least partially, feels like an examination of gender and its invented divides. The specific divide there is the double standard regarding acceptable levels of clothing for men and women. Young is getting at the truth here, but more through image and figurative language than through plain declarations like the previous poem. But with that, let me show you 2 examples of telling that I don't find quite so good. In the creepypasta called The Russian Sleep Experiment, there's a moment where a character asks the last remaining patient, "What are you?" and the subject responds, "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds at night. We are what you sedate in the silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal heaven where we cannot tread." So I find this passage very unintentionally funny. Like, can you imagine if there were a moment in Frankenstein where the creature says, "Don't you see, Victor? All along I was a metaphor for nature versus nurture and an objective correlative for your worst habits, for your desire for greatness without thinking about the consequences." It's like if Darman tried to write a short story. Or imagine if, in Nethercott's case, she had just stated that the story was about yearning and that drowning was the objective correlative for yearning. Even though the author of The Russian Sleep Experiment is trying to use dialogue like Le Guin, it doesn't actually read like authentic dialogue because it's far too on the nose. Or, in the poetic case, you can look to pretty much any insta-poem for an example of all tell and no show. For example, this little number. I do not need the kind of love that is draining. I want someone who energizes me. This is kind of like if Madhavan Rees's poem didn't have the first 15 lines and was instead the last line but with a couple of line breaks inserted. In fact, as part of this video, I wanted to try to take a showing poem and rewrite it to be all telling, but that proved to be a tremendously hard feat. In a showing poem, the showing is kind of the entire backbone of the poem. All I could think to do is what I just said, delete the first 15 lines of To Thousand Island. What Core's piece here feels like it's missing is the showing that justifies this very plain statement. What's more, going back to Gardner's advice, to say that a certain kind of love is draining is a cliché, which detracts all the more from the piece. Okay, now, to get into our last two layers of show don't tell, I want to talk about some of my personal experiences in my MFA program. One of the most important lessons I've had to learn as an aspiring author is to get out of my own way. You have to realize that, as a fiction writer, no matter how good you are, the reader is not there for you. They're there for the story. Consider this quote from James Baldwin that my advisor once showed me. "I read everything. I read my way out of the 2 libraries in Harlem by the time I was 13. One does learn a great deal about writing this way. First of all, you learn how little you know. It is true that the more one learns, the less one knows. I'm still learning how to write. I don't know what technique is. All I know is that you have to make the reader see it. Anything that prevents the reader from seeing it, you need to get that out of the way." Or, to quote my advisor directly in his email to me, "I guess this is about humility, about your being the servant of the story and not its boss, as it were. You're too good a writer to be the star of the show, because the star of the show is the character in your story, who is never and will never and has never been a character but a real person. That is, paradoxically, you're not in charge here. It's the character, and you're just following." My advisor put it another way. The last person I need to hear from is me. Let me reemphasize, we are servants to the things we write. If there is anything that is not in service to the piece's overall project, it is our duty to remove those things. This is often what writers mean when they say, "kill your darlings." As Steve Almond says, the pleasure of storytelling is that the author boils away all the fruitless session work and delivers only the vital moments of transformation and self-revelation. This ties in nicely to the other point I want to make, something I'm working on right now with my current advisor. Right now I'm working on flash fiction pieces, the endings of which are very hard to nail. We've already dipped into telling, showing, and endings with some of the examples I've shown so far, but bear with me. My advisor who gave me the advice about brushstrokes also wrote me the following. Thinking of how Matt Bell once told me that the end of a story is where the writer reveals their worldview. The writer, not the character. And that can happen in a number of ways using craft techniques. For Flash, though, there's just not enough room to get at the worldview in any complex way, so the revelation of the worldview has to be a little more pointed, quicker. Maybe this is the objective correlative that you've been thinking of. The George Saunders idea of brushstrokes applies here as well. Little brushstrokes could make that worldview rise to the surface easily. I do think that before you can find the objective correlative or reveal the worldview in clever ways at the end of the story, you have to just know what your particular worldview is. You want to express a worldview at the end of the story, but the story can't feel that it was in service to an easily expressed opinion. It has to feel larger than any argument, larger than you. So the balance is almost impossible, and I guess it's the great work of your life to find that balance. That balance is indeed almost impossible. This is something I've said on the second channel multiple times. It's hard to know the line between giving your audience too little and spoon-feeding them, in terms of context, plot, and meaning. This is absolutely the great work of the writer's life. I think this Almond quote pairs nicely with the paraphrase of Matt Bell's advice. The author's job isn't to absolve any of her major characters, but to reveal them in sufficient depth that we recognize ourselves. And I've said this many times, ultimately the point of all literature is empathy. All creative writing is about what it means to be human. In our pieces we write, whether poetry, flash, short stories, essays, novels, or memoirs, all of these should reveal something about ourselves. So I think this video encompassed a lot of the discussions around show don't tell, but I'm certain there are still many things I'm missing. Even so, I want to close with one last bit from Gardner. The good writer sees things sharply, vividly, accurately, and selectively. That is, he chooses what's important, because he cares about seeing things clearly and getting them down effectively. Partly he cares because he knows that careless seeing can undermine his project. Imagining the fictional scene imprecisely, failing to notice, for instance, the gesture that would in real life accompany some assertion by a character, the writer may be tricked into developing this situation in some way that is unconvincing. In other words, by selecting the right detail, the writer subtly suggests others. The telling detail tells us more than it says. But what do you think? Do you agree with the assertions made here, whether by me or by these authors? What do you think the balance is between telling and showing? What have you been told or learned on the topic? Please Tell me everything. And hey, before you go, take a look at this poem. This is an untitled piece by one of my patrons, Grace. I am learning how to peel you from my skin like an orange, like pitting an avocado, tossing the core, none of the good green stuff is wasted. I am learning to rid myself of the hard-to-chew parts. Spit me out on the sidewalk like that piece of gum sticking to your shoe in revenge, concrete-coated pink and sweet when you trip. I am the gravel in your teeth. For the chance to see one of your pieces at the end of my videos, or if you just like what I do here and want to support, you can donate to my Patreon too. For as little as $3 a month, you can see videos early, receive access to the community Discord, and hear more about the books I'm reading each month. You're seeing my patrons' names on screen right now, and I truly can't thank them enough. To support the channel in other important ways, all of the algorithm stuff really does help a lot. Liking, commenting, subscribing, hyping, painting things magenta, you know the drill. You can also support me on my socials if you want, but no matter what, keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately keep in mind, this is a rough draft. And for sticking around till the end of the video, have a writing prompt. For this prompt, I've written a poem that I've intentionally tried to make way too telly and not at all showy. I want you to rewrite this poem to show more. Here it is. You really hurt me. You hurt me in a way I can't believe. I thought I could trust you. Whatever happened to trust? I guess you're not the person I thought you were. Or maybe it's the other way around. So some things to consider. What are some experiences you've had lately that you can craft into a metaphor for ideas of hurt, trust, and betrayal? It can be something as simple as going to the grocery store and looking at a certain product. You can also consider personal experiences you've had in your life related to the topics the poem is trying to treat. Like Mata von Ries, you can use a personal anecdote to make all of the telling in this poem actually hit home. So, it's your turn now. Get to writing.